I've announced that the lesson today would be the king who ate grass. Found this interesting picture of this old man cutting grass and getting ready to eat it, and I thought that was a good thing. You know, there are a lot of wonderful and exciting stories that are found in the book of Daniel. And I'm afraid as adults sometimes that we get into our minds that some of these stories are just children's stories. But there are morals to the story. There are reasons why we're told what happened to these particular individuals. In the book of Daniel, we find the story about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and the great fiery furnace, and how that they were not burned up, and when they came out, they didn't even smell like fire had been upon or smoke had been upon their clothes. In the book of Daniel, we also read about the time that Shadrach, Daniel, and Meshach, and Abednego asked for a special diet from the king. When they were first taken to Babylon, and they were going to be given special meals, and they said, no, we don't want to do that. And so that story is there. Here's a picture of what somebody thought King Nebuchadnezzar looked like. And this is a story of several times in the book of Daniel that we're told about different things about Nebuchadnezzar. One thing I want you to remember about the book of Daniel, it is not in chronological order. The writer skipped around, and then there are different things that happen, and then he goes back, and then he goes forward, and it's sort of like some of the modern stories that we read today. My grandfather was always coming up with some kind of little ditty or poem that I have finally figured out had come from McGuffrey's Reader. And the one I was going to share with you is Nebuchadnezzar, the king of the Jews, he wore sandals and we wear shoes. Now my uncle, David, wrote this to me in an email, and I'm going to share with you what he wrote because I thought it was appropriate at this particular time. Because he remembers the same thing, but he remembers it differently than I do. That's because I'm old and he's older. And probably neither one of us remembered exactly like my grandfather told it. And this is what he wrote. He said, it was sort of a riddle. Nebuchadnezzar was the king of the Jews. He wore slippers, but I wear shoes. Can you spell that? And the answer is T-H-A-T. Now, this is typical Wallace Bible humor. Aunt Arwen, his aunt, my great aunt, liked to ask who was the shortest man in the Bible. And the answer was, it was once thought to be Nehemiah, but it's actually Bildad the Shuhite. And then there were jokes about these four did milk a bear, talking about her children. And Daddy also said that he asked a young Sail Creeker one time why she wasn't married. And her reply was, I told them what Paul said, I do not want you, ignorant brethren. So there are a lot of stories that come to us out of the book of Daniel, and sometimes things out of the original McGuffey's Readers. Now, most of you are not old enough to remember that, but this was the primary reader that was used many, many years ago. They are still in print if you'd like to see some of the stuff that was written then. Also in the book of Daniel, there's the story about Belshazzar. This is the king that saw the writing on the wall, meeny, meeny, tinkle, you farson. And then there was Darius the Mede, who put Daniel in the lion's den. And all of this is actually at the end of Daniel, when Daniel was old, and Daniel was a very interesting person that was used from time to time, called upon from time to time. It was sort of like many of our politicians today. He was in for a while, out for a while, then in for a while, then out for a while. And that's just the way the story goes in the book of Daniel. In the book of Daniel, we find one of the clearest prophecies that's ever made about the kingdom, the church, that is found in all of Old Testament prophecies. It's found in Daniel 2, verses 44 and 45. In the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. And that kingdom shall not be left to other people, but shall break in pieces and consume all of these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. For as much as you saw the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the brass, the clay, the silver, the gold, the great God has made known to the king what shall come to pass hereafter, and the dream is certain, and the interpretation is certain too. And this is part of the explanation of the great image that was there that has been told time and time and time again about the major kingdoms that existed prior to the establishment of the church. The book of Daniel is a book that's filled with wonderful people and strange occurrences. And one of those strange things is this king who ate grass. Now, one thing we have to remember, this is not the same stuff that they're smoking today. Or in salads or in brownies. So this is the real stuff. The same stuff that you feed animals. It's hard for us to imagine that any leader of a nation on earth who could do such a strange thing as to go crazy for 7 years, eat grass like animals of the field, and then be restored with honor, again assuming the leadership of the most powerful nation upon earth. Now the Babylonian kingdom extended from the Persian Gulf all the way to the Red Sea down to the nation of Egypt, covered much of what is found throughout all of Israel and Samaria, and today's what's Jordan, and even part of Turkey at this particular time. Later on, Darius the Mede comes along. The Median Empire covers not only the Babylonian Empire, but also much of that back to the east and also to the north. So this was a very large nation to have their leader go goofy for about 7 years and then come back and lead his nation. One of the things that's depicted in the book of Daniel is that Nebuchadnezzar has a dream about a tree. Most of us dream once in a while at least, maybe not real often, but sometimes we have some very strange dreams that we kind of scratch our head and wonder, what in the world did that mean? Why did I dream that? Or what did I eat to make me dream that kind of thing? But it's a strange dream about a great tree. As he's sleeping, this picture comes along about this huge, monstrous tree. This picture does not really do it justice. I have another one a little bit later on. But it was a tree that was so large that it could be seen throughout the ends of the earth. It was a very tall tree. It was a very strong tree, and its height reached to the heavens, and it could be seen to the ends of the world. It had beautiful leaves. It had abundant fruit. And the beasts of the field basked in its shade, and birds made nests in its branches. And then there is a description of it in Daniel, the 4th chapter. And thus were the visions of mine head in my bed, and I saw and behold a tree in the middle of the earth. And the height of it was great, and the tree grew, and it was strong, and the height therefore reached into heaven. And the sight therefore of the end of all of the earth, and the leaves therefore were fair, the fruit therefore was much, and it was meat for all, and the beast of the field had shadow under it, and the fowls of heaven dwelt in the boughs thereof, and all flesh was fed of it. I think it's important sometimes that when a preacher says something, it needs to be backed up with the scriptures. Because sometimes we say things and we just kind of move on, and you say, now what did he say? And how did he say it? And so by doing this, it helps you to remember what I'm trying to share with you. And then disaster strikes this tree. The Bible describes it like this. He says, a vision of my head, a watcher and a holy one came down from heaven. He cried aloud and he says, cut down the tree. Cut off its branches, shake off its leaves, scatter its fruit. Let the beasts get away from under it, and let the fowls away from its branches. Nevertheless, leave a stump of its roots in the earth, even with a band of iron and brass, in the tender grass of the field, and let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let his portion be with the beast of the grass on the earth. Now, what was pronounced upon Nebuchadnezzar is said several different times and occasionally just a little bit different than it was. We keep coming back to some of these things. Here is a beautiful picture that was made and shows the enormity of this particular tree that he saw in his vision as it's being chopped down, and the birds are flying away from it, and it's just an enormous tree. And then what's left is the stump. And there's a band of iron and brass that's put around upon it. I had hoped that I'd find something that was more than just sort of a caricature of what was there, but that's the best that I could find to kind of set this in your mind, what was taking place. And then there's strange orders that are given for King Nebuchadnezzar, something that is terrible that is going to happen to him. Daniel says, "This is what it means, O king. It is the decree of the Most High that has come upon my lord the king. You shall be driven away from human society. Your dwelling shall be with wild animals. You shall be made to eat grass like oxen, and you shall be bathed with the dew of heaven. And 7 times shall pass over you until you have learned that the Most High has sovereignty over the kingdom of mortals and gives it to whom he will." Now, in the scriptures, there is a study called numerology. And usually when a phrase like 7 times is there, usually is meant in the concept of years. You could probably think, well, maybe 7 days, 7 weeks, 7 months. But generally, this 7 times usually refers to the number of years. Now, this is not something that's going to happen to him for just a week. It's not going to happen to him for just a couple of months. But this is something that's going to happen to him for 7 years. It's sort of like trying to resurrect the president that has resigned and saying after 2 terms of another president that he comes back and he runs for office and that he gets back into office once again. That just doesn't happen. And normally in those days and times it did not happen too. A watcher comes and we ask the question, why does this happen to Nebuchadnezzar? What has he done? And more of the proclamation is given upon him that his heart is going to be changed from a man, and that a beast's heart is going to be given to him, and that 7 times will pass over him. And see the repetition that is here. This is a matter by the decree of the watchers and the demand of the word of the holy ones, to the intent that the living may know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men and gives it to whomever he will and sets it up over the basest of men. Well, Nebuchadnezzar had done something that God didn't like. He made an image of gold. The height was 70 cubits, about 90 feet. I don't know how tall the ceiling is in here. Anybody have a rough idea? Paul, do you know how tall that is? 40 feet? 50? That's a good guess. 35? Okay. Well, yeah. All right, we're talking about something that's about 2 to 3 times as tall as the inside of this building, made out of gold. And the breadth of it was 6 cubits, and he sets it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. And Nebuchadnezzar the king sent together the princes, the governors, the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the councils, the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces, everybody that's important, to come to the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. To the princes, the governors, the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, and all the rulers of provinces were gathered together into the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And the herald cried aloud, "To you it is commanded, O people, nations, and languages, that at what time you hear the sound of the cornet, the flute, the harp, the sackbut, the psaltery, the dulcimer, and all kinds of music, you will fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up." Doesn't say this, but it kind of implies that this is an image of Nebuchadnezzar. Now, that's the way I've always looked at it. I said, otherwise, I'm not too sure why God would be all that upset at the fact, except they're not worshiping the God of heaven. And so, here's a picture that somebody had painted that I thought was really good to give you an idea of what it looks like. And surprisingly enough, if you notice, you get the picture of Nebuchadnezzar on the right-hand side over here and the great image of the similarity that is there. There's another picture of this great tree. And as Nebuchadnezzar thinks about this, he calls all of his wise men and magicians and the astrologers and the Chaldeans and the soothsayers, and he says, "Tell me what this means." And they can't do it. They can't interpret the dream. And they were required to appear before Nebuchadnezzar, and he says, "You better tell me, or there's going to be rough consequences from this," but they can't do it. And so he calls Daniel. Daniel is called before Nebuchadnezzar to explain it, because Daniel's done this before. And Daniel's Babylonian name is Belteshazzar. And Nebuchadnezzar believes that Daniel has the power of God in him and that he can give the right meaning for a strange dream. And it appears that Daniel is kind of surprised at all of this for maybe one of two reasons. One, that Nebuchadnezzar is so confident in Daniel's ability to interpret the dream. Why me? And the second is the magnitude of what is going to happen to Nebuchadnezzar. You know, this is pretty tough stuff that's going to happen. So Daniel gives an interpretation of the dream. You see some things when you're dealing with electronics don't cooperate. So you got number 3 before you got number 1. Nebuchadnezzar is going to lose his kingship. He's going to live with the beast of the field. He's going to be wet with the dew of heaven. He's going to eat grass like an ox, and this is going to last for 7 years. Daniel says, "You will be driven away from human society. Your dwelling will be with wild animals. You'll be made to eat grass like oxen, and you'll be bathed with the dew of heaven, and 7 times will pass over you." There is a purpose why all of this is going to happen, and Daniel also gives that, and this is so that Nebuchadnezzar will know who really is in charge of the kingdoms of the earth. And after 7 years, the kingdom's going to be restored to Nebuchadnezzar after he comes to know that he is subject to the God of heaven. I found this picture, which I thought was kind of interesting, which a person thought that maybe Nebuchadnezzar would have looked like. And Daniel tells him that he's going to be punished for these 7 years. And then we ask the question again, what's the reason for all of this? Until you learn that the Most High has sovereignty over the kingdom of mortals, and he gives it to whomever he wishes. Then Daniel gives some more advice about Nebuchadnezzar's style of living. Now you have to remember, Nebuchadnezzar was not a Christian because Christianity had not come along yet, and he wasn't a Jew. And even though the little ditty from McGuffey's Reader says that he was the king of the Jews, only because he had conquered them and he was in charge of their lives. As it was commanded to leave the stump and the roots of the tree, your kingdom shall be reestablished for you from the time that you learn that heaven is sovereign. Therefore, O king, may my counsel be acceptable to you. Atone for your sins with righteousness. This is the first thing. And 2, your iniquities with mercy to the oppressed. He evidently wasn't taking care of folks that had difficulties and problems and medical problems and age problems and whatever they might be, so that your prosperity will be prolonged. And all of this came upon King Nebuchadnezzar. What is he told? Stop sinning and show mercy to the poor. Then the prophecy comes to pass. One day Nebuchadnezzar is walking in his kingdom, in his throne room, in his palace, and about a year later, all of this begins to take place. There's enough time for him to kind of forget what Daniel had said about the dream. He had maybe even forgotten the dream itself, and he's there and he's looking out and he's thinking of all of the great wonderful things that I've done. And he admires his own accomplishments. And a voice from heaven speaks to him. At the end of 12 months, he was walking on the roof of the royal palace in Babylon, and the king said, "Is not this magnificent Babylon, which I have built as a royal capital by my mighty power and for my glorious majesty?" You know what it sounds like? From the New Testament, about the guy that said, well, you know, I'm rich and I've got to tear down my barns because I have prospered and I have made all of this and doing all these things. Almost identical to that, isn't it? While the words were in the king's mouth, a voice came from heaven. "O King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is declared, the kingdom is departed from you, and you shall be driven away from human society, and your dwelling shall be with the animals of the field, and you shall be made to eat grass like oxen. And 7 times will pass over you until you have learned that the Most High has sovereignty over the kingdom of mortals and gives it to whomever that he will." Again, let that sink into your mind a little bit of what he might have looked like. He eats grass like an ox. His body is wet with the dew of heaven. His hair grows like eagle's feathers. His nails are like bird's claws. He is a crazy person who lives like a beast in the field that nobody can tame. Somebody painted this little picture about the man eating grass from a box. Made him look a little more human than the other artist did. And then, at the end of 7 years, the king finally gets it. At the end of 7 years, he looks to heaven. His right mind returns to him. He praises God and honors him who lives forever. And he's restored to his position as the king of Babylon. That's a fantastic story that is really hard to believe. But it says this in the scriptures. When the period was over, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven. My reason returned to me. I blessed the Most High and praised the honored the one who lives forever, for his sovereignty is an everlasting sovereignty, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are counted as nothing. He does what he wills with the host of heaven and the inhabitants of the earth. There is no one who can stay his hand and say to him, "What are you doing?" At that time, my reason returned to me, and my majesty and splendor were restored to me for the glory of my kingdom. My counselors and my lords sought me out, and I was reestablished over my kingdom, and still more greatness was added to me. His honor, his power, and his authority was even better at the end of these 7 years. And that's hard for us to really think about it. You know, it's really a very strange story. A king who goes crazy, he eats grass like an ox, and then he's restored after 7 years as the king of his nation. But you know, this second Nebuchadnezzar is different from the first one. You see, He's wiser. He's more knowledgeable. He recognizes who is really in charge of all things. And he gives praise and honor to the God of heaven. What are the lessons for us? Well, we need to remember that we are the creatures and not the creators. And as smart as we get and as smart as we think we are, we just don't know everything. It's kind of interesting to think of all of the things that you and I have learned over the years. Did you know that the kids that are learning high school stuff today are learning the same thing that you and I learned in college? And they have kind of sifted that down because there's more stuff for them to learn now than there ever has been. We need to give God the glory and the honor and all power and dominion over us. What's wrong with the world today? This is what's wrong with the world. Doesn't give God the credit for all of what He's done and what He's like and what He can do. And thirdly, if we don't give Him the glory and the honor, God can and will depose us from wherever we are. If you have difficulties in your life, it may be because you're thinking you're doing it on your own. If you're trying to do it on your own without God's help, you're missing the whole point of why that you're here upon the face of the earth. And finally, He can bring us down. He can set us up because we are His servants. The real question in all of this is the same question that was really put to King Nebuchadnezzar. Do you serve the God of heaven? If you don't, today there's a chance for you to start over in your life and to make that right and submit yourself to Him and give yourself to Him. Mark's going to sing a song for us here in just a moment, or lead us in a song. And it's an opportunity for you. If you've never given yourself to Jesus Christ and to God, today would be a good time. All of these terrible things that happened to Nebuchadnezzar are not things that will probably happen to you. But you also have to recognize that God's in charge. You have to listen to Him, and you have to obey Him. If you're here this morning and you need to become a Christian, the opportunity is yours. If you're a child of God that's wandered away, it's a good opportunity for you to come back. If you need to respond to the invitation, would you come while we stand and sing?